Hello and welcome back to Make Finance Easy. In today's video, we're going to go about everything you need to know on the AP Macroeconomics exam. So if you're taking the AP Macroeconomics exam, these are the 6 major units you need to understand. But the AP exam isn't just about memorizing definitions. You need to go graphs, formulas, cause and effect relationships, and how government policies change the economy. So, in the next few minutes, we're going to go through the most important things you should know before testing. First is the foundation: scarcity, opportunity cost, comparative advantage, and the production possibilities curve. Scarcity means resources are limited, while wants are unlimited. Because resources are scarce, every opportunity has an opportunity cost. The next best alternative you give up. For comparative advantage, remember, comparative advantage equals a lower opportunity cost. If one country can produce something at a lower opportunity cost, that country should specialize in that good and trade. You also need to understand the production's possibilities curve, or the PPC. A point inside the curve shows inefficient production. A point on the curve means productive efficiency, and a point outside the curve is currently unattainable. And economic growth shifts the PPC outwards. Next, Unit 2, Economic Indicators and the Business Cycle. Next, you need to know 3 major economic measurements: GDP, unemployment, and inflation. GDP measures the market value of final goods and services produced within a country. The basic GDP equation is GDP equals consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. Net exports is basically just equal to exports minus the imports. For unemployment, you need to know the differences between frictional, structure, and cyclic unemployment. Frictional unemployment happens when people are between jobs. Structural unemployment happens when worker skills don't match available jobs. And cyclic unemployment is caused by a downturn in business cycles. And remember, the natural rate of unemployment equals frictional and structural unemployment, but not cyclic unemployment. For inflation, you got to understand the Consumer Price Index, or the CPI. Inflation means the general price levels rising. The AP exam may give you a price index and ask you to calculate the inflation rate. Also, you got to remember the business cycle of expansion, peak, contraction, and trough. During expansion, real GDP generally rises and unemployment follows. But during recession, real GDP falls and cyclic unemployment rises. Then, Unit 3, National Income and Price Determination. This is one of the biggest units of AP Macro, and one that I saw the most common in. You need to absolutely understand aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus NX, which I'll get into later. The AD curve slopes downwards, and the major things that shift the AD include changes in consumption, C, investment I, government spending G, and net exports NX. For example, if the government increases spending, the AD shifts right. If consumer confidence falls, consumption decreases, and the AD shifts left. Now, you need to understand the SRAS, or short run aggregate supply, and the LRAS, or long run aggregate supply. In the short run, an increase in AD can increase both the real GDP and the price level. In the long run, the economy tends towards its potential output. You also need to know the difference between a recessionary gap and an inflationary gap. A recessionary gap occurs when actual output is below the potential output. An inflationary gap occurs when actual output is above the potential output. And remember the multiplier. The spending multiplier tells you a change in spending can cause a larger change in real GDP. So, if the government increases spending by $10 billion, the total increase in GDP can be greater than $10 billion. The same general idea applies to the tax multiplier, although the tax multiplier is smaller in absolute value than the spending multiplier. Then let's talk about Unit 4, the financial sector. Now let's talk about money and banking. You need to know the functions of money, like medium exchange, unit of account, and store of value. You need to know the differences between M1 and M2, and understand that checking deposits are part of the money supply. And then comes the banking system. Banks take deposits and uses some of those deposits to make loans. The required reserve ratio determines how much banks keep in reserve. And this simple multiplier equation is 1 divided by required reserve ratio. So if the reserve requirement was 20%, the simple multiplier is 5. But remember, this is just a simplified model. The actual increase in money supply can be smaller if banks hold excessive reserves or people hold cash. You also need to understand the Federal Reserve. If the Fed wants to fight inflation, it can use contractionary monetary policy. This means raising interest rates or decreasing the money supply, which generally decreases investments and aggregate demand. If the economy is in a recession, the Fed can use expansionary monetary policy. This means lowering interest rates and increasing the money supply, which encourages investment and spending. So you got to know the chain. Money supply increases, interest rate falls, investment increases, aggregate demand increases, and the real GDP increases because of that. Now, let's talk about Unit 5, long-run consequences of stabilization policies. Unit 5 connects economic policies to the long run. You need to understand fiscal policy, monetary policy, inflation, unemployment, and economic growth. Fiscal policy is controlled by the government. An expansionary fiscal policy increases government spending or decreases taxes. This increases aggregate demand. A contractionary fiscal policy decreases the government spending or increases taxes. This decreases the aggregate demand. But there can be a problem called crowding out. If the government runs a larger deficit and borrows more, it can push interest rates upwards. Higher interest rate can reduce private investment. And then you also need to know about the Phillips curve. In the short run, there can be an inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. But in the long run, the economy returns to the natural rate of unemployment. So the long run Phillips curve is vertical. And finally, know what causes economic growth. Growth can come from increases in physical capital, human capital, technology, and productive resources. Economic growth increases in economy's productive capacity and shifts the LRAS to the right. And finally, Unit 6, Open Economy. The final unit is international trade and finance. You're going to know the difference between appreciation and depreciation of a currency. If the dollar appreciates, it becomes more valuable relative to another currency. American goods become relatively more expensive to foreigners, so U.S. exports decrease. Foreign goods become relatively cheaper to Americans, so U.S. imports increase. Therefore, the dollar appreciation leads to exports decreasing, and that leads to imports increasing, which eventually leads to net exports decreasing. So, if the dollar depreciates, the opposite generally happens. So you should also understand the current account, financial account, exchange rates, and balance of payments. And remember, trade creates gains from specialization based on comparative advantage. So, to conclude everything, here's what to expect on the exam. So what should you actually expect? The AP Macro exam has 60 multiple choice questions in 70 minutes, which are followed by 3 free response questions in 60 minutes, 1 long FRQ and 2 short FRQs. And this exam will test more than definitions. You should expect questions involving lots of graphs, calculations, economic scenarios, and cause and effect relationships, and policy analysis. For the FRQs, make sure you label your graphs correctly, show your calculation, and explain your reasoning. Don't just write that something increases. Say what increases, why it increases, and what happens as a result of that increase. And if you remember nothing else, remember the major chain reactions. Expansionary fiscal policy, aggregate demand right. Contractionary fiscal policy, aggregate demand left. Expansionary monetary policy, this leads to interest rates going down, investment going up, and the AD going right. Contractionary monetary policy, this leads to interest rates up, investments down, and the AD going to the left. Then currency appreciation leads to exports going down, imports going up, and the net exports going down. And finally, economic growth leads to productive capacity increasing and the long run aggregate supply shifting right. So, if you can understand those relationships, draw the major graphs, and confidently use the key formulas, you'll be in a strong position for AP Macroeconomics. Good luck, and remember, don't just memorize the graphs, understand why they shift. And I'll see you guys in the next video of Make Finance Easy.